Good afternoon. It's so nice of everyone to come at this late notice. Today, the Greenwich Preservation Trust is presenting the Connecticut Trust, Greg Stroud, who's the Special Projects Manager, to discuss the rails, the high-speed rails. I just want to tell you how we got involved with this. We've been involved 6 months now. We were connected with the Connecticut Trust because one of our members said, I think we better call the Connecticut Trust because it's very important that they know they're going into our special neighborhoods that are historic. So we contacted the Connecticut Trust, and they said, oh, we have a special person working on that. And that's how we were introduced to Greg. So today, Greg Stroud's here, Special Projects Director, and I believe Wes Hames is here also. He's a Special Director of Projects. I want to introduce, we have some people in the audience who are from our state legislature. Livy Foreign, and I think I see Fred Camillo somewhere, and right there sitting to Mike Buccino. Thank you very much for coming. And, and also, oh, I'm sorry, we have one of our selectmen down from, were you invited here especially from down our selectman's office, Mr. Toner. Thanks for coming also. I guess I've introduced everybody, so now.
The first select woman from Darien is here.
Pardon? Oh, and I see, I'm sorry, and I see also Mr. Franz, our very special person who's worked with the Connecticut Trust and the Greenwich Preservation Trust. Thank you for coming, Senator Franz. I hope I didn't miss anybody. Okay, Greg, it's all yours.
Thank you, Joe. Well, first, I'd like to thank you all for coming out on last-minute notice and to thank Joe Conboy, and I think Ann Young is probably here too. So when the Connecticut Trust comes to a region and we deal with an issue like this, most of all, we want to work with the local communities and find local partners. And I think we have some excellent partners here. And Joe Conboy for the last 6 months has been really instrumental in setting the groundwork for what I think will be, I hope, a very effective response for Tier 2. So for the last 18 months, I have worked on this issue with the Connecticut Trust pretty much 7 days a week. We have had, I think, a pretty successful effort in the eastern portion of the state. Where there was a similar project, and it was called the Kenyon to Old Saybrook Bypass, which most famously, I think, ran through the historic district of Old Lyme at a height of 40 feet, and then hit many of the towns to the east, including New London, Mystic, Stonington, across into Rhode Island, Charlestown, Rhode Island. So as of July 12th, we have taken that project, at least temporarily, off the table. But as of July 12th, we have a very different situation down here in Fairfield County, where we have something called the New Rochelle to Greens Farms Bypass. Now, that project is, while much less well-known than the project in the eastern part of the state, would have perhaps, I would say, vastly more impact. So the fact that it's still on the table, the fact that it's actually a much more impactful, in a broader sense, plan gives us a lot of concern, and I think you should see the Connecticut Trust is taking this very seriously, and partially we have 2 members of the staff, we have multiple board members here because we're looking at this to find partners, to find regional partners in government and outside of government to respond and find the best solution for this region. And so as I come here with a very strong point of view, but hopefully my talk will work for whether you're a proponent or an opponent of this plan. I think much of the advice will be the same. So let me get started, and I'll try to keep this tight because I know many of you, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you have places to go, and we'd like a lively question and answer afterwards. So I'll try to talk for about 20 minutes. You can start coughing if I go long. and I won't beat around the bush. So we're lucky in Connecticut that perhaps the single most informed person outside of the Federal Railroad Administration on this plan happens to be our Commissioner of Transportation in Connecticut. He also happens to be co-chair of the NEC Commission, which will take a leading role in what we call Tier 2, which is the current phase we're in right now, developing and implementing this plan. So that said, let me quote him from, I believe it's Sunday's Connecticut Post. So the most knowledgeable, someone that knows more about this plan than me. Quote, "It's not real and it's not funded." Quote, "What FRA embraced is a vision, a philosophy, or a statement about the future. It's an exercise in planning." And let me pile on. Connecticut, currently, I don't have to tell you, Connecticut has a terrible budget situation. We have $22 billion in debt from fiscal year 2016, which makes it very difficult to fund transportation projects. This plan, I think you've seen, had a price tag that comes out at $150 billion. So that said, why are we here? You know, is this buildable? Is this an exercise that's not funded? Is this real? And I guess I'd start to respond to that this way. We have a problem. Whether you're for this or whether you're against this, we have a fundamental problem in the Metro New York area and in Fairfield County in particular with transit. And if we turn and we look, and here's a map of our problem, and it comes from Master, an infrastructure plan from 2010 that was produced by Amtrak, and it shows what capacity will look like and what the capacity problems are in Fairfield County by 2030. So that's roughly 15 years from now. And if you look, and I'll zoom in, if you look at the red shows us areas that will equal or exceed capacity along the existing rail by 2030. And so if you notice, I believe New Rochelle to Greens Farms, it will all be at or exceeding capacity within 15 years. If you look at the Northeast Corridor from a planner's perspective or from a politician's perspective, you say that 3/4 of the population growth and job growth along the Northeast Corridor will happen in 4 major cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., right? And so how do you move those people around? How do you feed what is 1/5 of the American economy? And in this area, how do you take something that I think is essential to the health of Fairfield County, which is our commuter rail, and how do we efficiently move people, and in fact, move people better back and forth from, say, Stamford to New York, from Greenwich to New York, and back. And so we have a problem. I don't think that the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, didn't come to Fairfield County and say, let's build a terrible project through the wealthiest real estate, the hardest market to run rail through. They didn't propose this project because they just figured, what the heck, or because there's no problem. They did it because they have a there's a real reason. Let me just take this. There we go. So in terms of ridership, if you look, Metro North, by 2030, we're looking at roughly doubling, as well as for Amtrak, roughly doubling ridership. These are again projections that are the basis of this plan. So I guess my point is, when we look at this and we see, I think we all agree, whether we're for or against this, we have to do something. I hope that the Connecticut DOT and the Federal Railroad Administration are attacking this or approaching this problem with more than exercises and visions. And in fact, I think they are. And what we have is, in fact, we have a very serious plan. And it's called NEC Future. And it is what we think of as a once in a generation or once in every other generation plan to modernize the Northeast Corridor and to create an infrastructure blueprint for how we will invest and modernize in transportation between Boston and Washington, D.C. And so when we look at this, we say, oh, how will they fund $150 billion of projects? Well, here's the deal. There's a $150 billion price tag on NEC Future. There was one until July 12th. After July 12th, there's no longer a $150 billion price tag. In fact, the plan will be moved forward piecemeal. So project by project, through the next stages of environmental review and through the next funding processes. And so piece by piece, every additional rail, every foot of platform, every extra bit of wiring, the funding for that, if it takes federal funding, whether it's high-speed rail, commuter rail, freight rail, regional or intercity, every single federal dollar will be in part determined by this plan, piecemeal. So if Greenwich wants to increase the length of its platform, and they want federal dollars to help pay for that, they send the plan to the FRA or the FTA, the US DOT, and there's someone that looks and will say, is this consistent with NEC Future? And if it's not consistent, you can still build it. Nothing will compel Connecticut to build the New Rochelle to Greens Farms bypass, and nothing will stop Connecticut from building whatever it wants. But the plan has a carrot and a stick. And this is where the budget situation in some ways works against us, is that with this kind of planning, what we should expect is roughly 80%, 20% funding. So that means, and for every $100 of projects, for every $100, 80 of those dollars will come from the federal government. 20 of those dollars will come from Connecticut. So, but that only applies to plans that conform to NEC Future. So if Connecticut and Fairfield County look at this plan and they say, you know, this one looks really, this looks terrible for Fairfield County. Maybe we want to run the rail up I-84. Maybe we want to run it some other way. Fine, Connecticut can do it, but as it stands today, if those plans are not in the blueprint, they will not be funded. And so how long does this blueprint last? How long is this in effect? When we think of an exercise, we think of something that you do repeatedly, right? You do this every couple of years. Well, the current blueprint that was just replaced on July 12th, that blueprint dates to 1978. So we've had a blueprint from 1978 until July 12th. This blueprint, and the blueprint was finalized. In fact, it's set. This blueprint will exist from July 12th until at least 2040, and we think more like 2065. So, is this a vision? Yes. Is this an exercise? Yes. Is this a very important one? I'd say yes. And part of the problem is, what is it? Where does it go? What are the impacts? Where are the maps? You can't really be for or against something unless you really even know what it is. So here's a map. I have printed maps up here of the same project. I have them online at a place called Seacoast, secoast.org. You can download these maps and you can blow them up. One thing I will tell you is that the maps show a lot of construction up in the air. You wonder how you build rail through Fairfield County. How do you deal with the rock? How do you deal with all the on-ramps and off-ramps? Well, you build over them. 40 feet, 60 feet in the air. So most of what you see, if you look on this map and you see blue, you see at grade. You see red, you see is aerial structure, which is a viaduct or a bridge. If you see green, you see embankment. So certainly from this area, you see pretty much it's entirely up in the air. So it's one of the problems when you look at the initial maps, you see them without the type of construction. You say, oh, there's a route. You have no idea what it means. It's a lot different if they build it on the ground and they build it 40 feet in the air. So this, what we're looking at is 29 miles of new right-of-way. It would be 2-track. Roughly, it standardizes 150 feet. It very likely would, in actual construction, would come in more narrowly than that. The rail could officially run at 220 miles an hour. Whether it does or not is another question. Our sense is the point of it is, as you might know, the New Haven line is not owned by Amtrak. So part of the point here would be to build essentially an Amtrak line, to take the higher speed rail off of the existing Metro North, let the Metro North run and essentially run through. There would be stops at Stamford, at Greens Farms if that rail station is built. Sort of an odd idea, we think, for a major rail hub in Greens Farms. But nevertheless, as planned. For Connecticut, we see really the primary, if you think in terms of transportation, the primary beneficiaries of this plan would perhaps in certain ways be Stamford and New Haven, who could have better service, but there would be significant impacts to Stamford, to Westport, to Darien, to Greenwich. We're talking widespread, potentially block-wide swaths of neighborhoods. We have a lot of concerns, and one thing that we want to do is we want to get better maps. These maps are pretty disappointing. Even when you zoom in. Let's see, there we're in Greenwich. Red is up in the air, green is embankment. Not very good. So we do know that the Federal Railroad Administration has high-quality maps with something GIS maps with something they call a data viewer, and that state agencies have been given access to these maps. Whether they've looked at them or not is another question. One thing that I would strongly encourage representatives and the public would be to ask for access to these maps going forward. Seems like a reasonable request knowing what it is, whether you're for it or against it. In part because Tier 2, the stage that we're in, is a funny one. You see the actual routes were finalized on July 12th. The route selection, the route drawing is done. The route selection, the route drawing stage lasted from 2012 to 2017. Tier 2 is the implementation stage. And that begins with something that we call the development of a service development plan. And a service development plan, which is the sort of plan, a 10-year plan for how we implement that. That will be drawn up over the next year. And the good news is that that will be run through the NEC Commission. Co-chair of the NEC Commission is James Redeker. So it would be, I'd encourage representatives here to find out exactly what Connecticut's goals are in that service development plan, what they plan to implement, the priorities. Our sense is that much of this, what you're seeing, is not a top priority for the Federal Railroad Administration. In fact, the top priority is something called a state of good repair. And that means, I think, pretty uncontroversial. That means fixing what we have, updating various of the bridges around. You probably know the Norwalk Bridge problem. The Norwalk Bridge project is going on. Well, there would be a Saugatuck Bridge, the Devon Bridge, all these projects. Enormously controversial and perhaps impactful on their own, but they're things that I think pretty much everyone agrees has to happen in some form, and it's just a question of engagement and getting the best possible solution. So those projects over the next 15 years would be key, and then we start moving on to tougher things like this, right? Piecemeal. A second. Let me see. Okay. So, a couple of concerns. One is that when we look at the plan, and we're hoping, I don't know how many of you look at this and say, gee, great, how quickly can we fund it? Maybe some of you. Or how quickly can we modify it? How can we modify this and make it the best possible plan for this area? Part of, when you're asking that question, whether you're for it or against it, here's something you should know. I don't know the exact answer. How much flexibility is there on the route to adjust the route in Tier 2? So the route is selected. To get this route out of the plan will be very difficult. In fact, when I talked to James Redeker last July about it, he said, A, if it's not in the plan, he paused and he said, nope, I don't think it will be built. And he said, B, that once it's in the plan, it'll be there. So, but that's just an offhand conversation. This is, at this point, I think, what as representatives and what as members of the public you need to ask is how much flexibility is there to, say, adjust the route? So as there is something in this plan that we think of as a planning envelope. And that's basically, as they plan it, they look at either side of the route, and there's a little bit of wiggle room. Our sense in Fairfield County, and part of the problem we're engaging here, is you can move it 200 feet off of I-95, but it's not going to get easier. So we have a general sense that what it is pretty much what you get. But the point is to draw the lines as straight and as flat as possible. If you think you can just run over I-95 or run over the existing rails, they're not straight enough. There's flatness issues. There's all kinds of problems. If they could do it, they would, and they'd tell you. So wait one second. So one question everyone should be asking is, can we adjust the routes 250 feet north and south? Can we adjust them 500 feet? My sense is less than 1,000 feet, either way. But something that's what you should be thinking about. It doesn't matter much if you don't have the great maps. Now, if you're from the Federal Railroad Administration, you'd say, I'll give them credit. They'll say, we could let you look at those great maps, but they'd mislead you. Because all the detail that you're seeing really isn't there. Because there's some fuzziness. We can move them. So then the answer is how much? The other thing I think you guys should be asking is, well, we've got a menu. We've got a 40-year menu of solutions. On this menu, there's only one dish. There's only one solution for Fairfield County, and that's the New Rochelle to Greens Farms bypass. So you should also be asking, well, is it possible for us to add a new dish to the menu in the next 40 years, next 30 years, next 20 years? Can we add a new dish? Can we take this dish off? My sense is that will not be easy. And my general sense from speaking to lawyers who are quite experienced on this issue is that that once we've entered this stage, Tier 2, it becomes much more of a legal issue. Fighting the federal government is not easy. It's not something I think anyone wants to do, and I don't think we want to delay needed investment on the Northeast Corridor. I would suggest one thing to worry about and to ask in the near term, and I have a call in with the acting counsel for the FRA, is what's our window for a simple response? So whether we want to look in terms of legal response or whatever, we want to leave every option on the table. We want to engage with the federal government and the administration in ways they say to exhaust all administrative remedies. So if you want to turn to the courts, you have to do everything in your power to allow the federal government, to allow the FRA to do the right thing. And that requires engagement. And part of the problem with engagement right now is for the last 18 months, we've been engaging with one plan, basically one agency. Now, as we move into Tier 2, we could be engaging with dozens of plans, dozen agencies, all kinds of things. It's a big task. And I would suggest, in all soberness, that it's a task that isn't going away, whether you support this or whether you oppose it. If you don't engage it, I'll give you something that you don't want to happen. I know many people drive south and they drive across the Susquehanna River through a town called, it's Havre de Grace. So Havre de Grace is also on the Northeast Corridor, and they have a project that's related to NEC Future, but it's not part of NEC Future. It's a related plan. And so it is to build I think it's somewhere between $2 and $5 billion. And it runs through the historic district, which has 1,000 National Register structures. It runs across, and the town has modestly engaged the project. They just reached a record of decision, which is essentially, that means the next stage of record of decision, so the Tier 2 record of decision. And they got something, actually, it's not quite right. There was a determination that there was what they call a FONSI. And that means a finding of no significant impact. So they found essentially a large 2-track structure running straight through the historic district. There was sturgeon, environmental issues, sturgeon breeding grounds, all sort of a whole panoply of impacts. But from the federal perspective, they looked at it and they said, you know, it's running along existing infrastructure. In this case, for you guys, it's running along 95. They don't run these projects through empty backyards. They run the projects through fuller backyards, because then it's more easy to have findings of no significant impact. And so in that case, this town, because they didn't engage, something was going to be built, but because they didn't engage, they had a pretty bad finding. And in terms of what we refer to mitigation, so how does the federal government make it right? Whether it's money or whether it's building a better structure, historic structure, they essentially got nothing. And in that case, the offers were provisional offers to dye the concrete piers a more historically correct color. And I will tell you, if you look at the record of decision, those were provisional assurances that would be worked out at the next level. I think they'll happen. But nevertheless, that is what I'd say is even if you're for the project, you should be engaging just as much as if you're against the project. And I would suggest, because Fairfield County, and then I'll shut up and let you take questions, because we're in Fairfield County, something is going to happen. Something should happen, frankly. If the federal government does nothing to modernize infrastructure between Stamford and New York, then Fairfield County is a loser as well, right? And so what I will say is this: when you look for your solutions, or you look for your better solutions, or you look for mitigation, to the east, how did we manage to take this project out of the plan and off the table so they could study it some more? this isn't going to be built right away. Why not study it a little bit more, engage the public? I suspect no one in this room has really engaged with this topic. You kind of should. So we said in there, we got them to take it out of the plan, and that's Eastern Connecticut. There's not that much money, there's not that much power there compared to Fairfield County. We did that because we got Old Lyme, Mystic, New London, Charlestown, Rhode Island, Providence, all sitting down at the same table and agreeing. And I'll tell you what, one of the turning points is when the mayor of New London sat down, and that's a transit hub, that's a hub that depends on the good graces of the Connecticut DOT and Amtrak. And they sat down at a table and they said, you know what, we stand with Old Lyme. And that was a great statement, and that's a statement where people take notice. People took notice, and it set the tone for a kind of regional cooperation that we had. That's something that Connecticut, it's hard for Connecticut. You know, we've got these great, small, distinctive towns, but it's hard for them to work together. And this ideally, as I come down here, I come down as a representative of the Connecticut Trust, but hopefully not to tell you guys what to do, but to listen to you and to try to give you the best possible information and to try to facilitate some kind of regional approach and regional way to work against this sort of massive plan, which I encourage you to take seriously. So with that, I will stop and I'll take questions. We should pass around the mic as we do. This gentleman had his hand up first, so I'll.
So I still don't understand exactly what this project is. Is this to replace what exists now so that all trains will run on this new project? And if so, does the old railroad get torn up? And the other major question I have is, you know, with the Shikozen in Japan and with the high-speed rail in China, they took a ruler and made a straight line, because that's what you need for fast trains. This seems to have a lot of curves still.
This plan, technically they engineer it so hopefully every portion of the plan is supposed to be engineered to handle 220 miles an hour. I'm not an engineer and I don't want to pretend to be one, but my sense is that I've been told that the A-team is working on this plan. They're not drawn, it's not a crayon drawing. They're serious people, and that so that the straight lines, they're drawing as straight as they can, if you would. Let me show you, I forgot, let me show you just a vision of what the same company is, and it'll show you some problems that what the same company, Parsons Brinckerhoff, is engineering in the San Joaquin Valley. As you might guess, the challenges of the San Joaquin Valley are very different than the challenges in Fairfield County. So take a look. It's 2 minutes. I think it's worthwhile. So here we'll have, this is sort of the vision. Once it's done, we have something that would be kind of like 95. We have an existing rail track that's running along 95, and then we have a new rail corridor above in the air. So this would be the existing. This is how they would build above it in part, but then you think, oh, can we build above it entirely? No. We have to cross, because it's straighter, watch. They'll come across the platform at an angle and come off and then continue on with, so it would be on above in as much as they can, but not entirely. No, this would not be an attempt to get rid of any of the existing rail. It's in addition to the existing rail. 1 second, and then I'll see you in there. So this would be an aerial structure, a viaduct. Hopefully mitigation would make it a little prettier. But if you don't engage, it's more likely you'll get something that will look just like that. It's built up in the air in part to get over things, so it's as flat as possible. They try not to get a grade above 1.5%. So part of the issue, and a lot of times, is there's a lot of bridges that go at a 2% grade, and the high-speed rail won't do it. One of the key impacts that we're worried about is the crossing of the Mianus River. There's also some very interesting potential. We see some trenching around the Norwalk River plan that we don't quite understand. There's all kinds of things afoot. So, you know, in the San Joaquin Valley, you say, well, there isn't much that they're building over. It's controversial enough in itself, but you move that far off of I-95 and think where that is in Greenwich. So that, may I say, that's not an oppositional, that's Parsons Brinckerhoff showing this is the wonderful thing that we can do. 1 second, I know this gentleman.
Thank you. What are some alternatives to the traffic issues in the future in transportation, as opposed to, are there any? I mean, it's always good to oppose something with alternative.
NEC Future, this plan for Connecticut actually had 3 alternatives that were proposed. I know that Congresswoman Esty has supported an I-84 route that would go around. There have been Long Island routes. Those have problems. I assume that Stamford does not want high-speed rail to, and nor does New Haven want high-speed rail so there's reasons why they'd like to run this through this corridor. I don't have, like I say, I will not play amateur engineer. What I would encourage you to do is engage to try to get the best solution. This gentleman next.
Sir, I've been trying to visualize what would happen in downtown Greenwich on this. Now, my it is well known that the Greenwich Railroad Station is part of Greenwich Plaza, which has 2 large towers in it. I would suspect that any expansion plan of the tract would mean the demolition of those 2 buildings and similar buildings when you come into railroad stations along the line because it is so heavily built up. Could you comment on this?
I'm very wary, not knowing the exact route, to try to say that it's running through one property or the other. I will say that uncertainty is an issue. And in eastern Connecticut, where the real estate is worth significantly less, it actually had a significant effect on investment, on property sales and values. This market, I would encourage, that's one reason why I would encourage a sense of what the flexibility is, what the real maps are. We created we took that same platform you wrote and we created an artistic representation. It's not meant to be either scary or reassuring. We just threw it, we said, well, gee, we have an area in Greenwich that has existing rail. It has to cross across, it curves too much. They create a platform and that's about the scale and that's in the air. So something like that. I'll let you.
Pardon me, just for a moment. So I arrived a little late, but I would like to say a few global words to the room. First of all, my name is Charles Jansen. I'm the immediate former chair of the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. This all started on our watch. I can remember a call in the parking garage at the University of Vermont trying to start my daughter's car. You know, was it a year and a half ago, 2 years ago? But here we are. And I want to say this is a friendlier audience than I've experienced in the zoning room at times, or in front of the Architectural Review Commission. I'm a real estate attorney. I'm here to say thank you to Greg. And also, I don't know if you met Wes Haynes. I was a little late. Wes Haynes is our local circuit rider for the Connecticut Trust. But because of Greg's efforts, on July 12th, we got our opportunity. And what I mean by that is, think about the consequences if the Southeast Corridor had not been addressed and people were trying to address this FRA activity on 2 fronts. So now, the sleeper, I've always felt the sleeper was going to be whatever happened in Fairfield County, because my personal feeling was whoever was looking at these maps had no clue of what they were going to encounter in Fairfield County, nor would they encounter, if you go to the building officials, the current development that's going on in this corridor that can smudge. 1,000 feet either way is a significant difference. And also personally, I'm very invested in this. I've lived in Darien since 1988. I was a member of the Darien Land Trust for 16 years. I see Jamie Stevenson here, thank you. Our first selectman. Well, there we have very significant pieces of land that are conservation land, that are part of the Darien Land Trust holdings, that are bookended by either of the realignments that are going on. So I think that the big question of the moment is really the maps, but it's also quite encouraging what happened July 12th. In March, I met with our former executive director, with our entire congressional delegation. We met with all their staff. They're very aware of what was going on with Old Lyme and to the east. So you can only imagine the attention that is waiting to be given to this matter. So I just have one quick question, okay? I'm curious, very curious. So how many public officials do we have here in one capacity or another? Okay, how many public staff? How many, should we say, nonprofit groups that have an interest, like historic preservation and the environment? And then lastly, how many just plain citizens? I live close enough to 95 as well to be impacted. Well, that's just great, okay? So thank you very much for stepping out. I wanted to give a brief overview and a thank you, and I'll let you all continue with your questions. So I look at this only as Greg's preliminary work. He is continuing as our Special Projects Director for the Connecticut Trust. We're committed to this. He's well-versed in the background, and he'll be even more well-versed for you for the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much for this wake-up call. I was around when they wanted to widen the Hutch, right, and the whole thing, and the Regional Plan Association said if you build a bigger road, they will come, and so you'll have a higher congestion at a later date, which brought in the whole question of projections. Now, they have projected a usage factor, of substantial increases. That's, the old story about statistics and how dependable they are. And I remember that we were going to have a tax rate in town, or a population in town of 100,000 at the rate it was growing in 1960, and we're still the same. So all of these things make me concerned. When I come down to the basic question that I heard you mention, was this is a high-speed railroad. They have to use the old rail system that's present. In part. They'd rather not involve themselves with the New Haven Railroad network. They'd rather have their own high-speed network, which they can control and is custom-made, bespoke railroad, if you like. That's how we say it in Greenwich. Right? So why the heck would they do that when they could go through 84, where they could have their own route, totally unique to them, much easier, cheaper thing? I would think just the condemnation costs along the Fairfield County. When they say 150 billion, I could add another 100 billion without thinking about it. I mean, it's such a crapshoot in costs where you wouldn't have that kind of insecurity going north, and you would have better control for getting what you want. And what is their argument against that? Stamford and New Haven?
The I-84 route, which I think when we look at I-84 and we look at potentially the idea of moving the rail, or the high-speed rail at least, off of the coast and into the interior, we see the potential to help distressed towns and to find a plan that works for Connecticut, because here's part of the problem with high-speed rail for Connecticut. Do you remember how I said that this plan is being driven by 4 cities and a 75% statistical increase in employment and population?
We had that from Eversource also.
So unfortunately, as you might recall, none of those 4 cities exists in Connecticut. Connecticut is a state of small cities. And so high-speed rail is not a natural fit for Connecticut. And so in many ways, Connecticut has been in a position where most of the impacts and few of the benefits are really for. We're pretty much a fly-through state. That said, any regional cooperation that does not serve the needs of Stamford, that's not good for Fairfield County. And so the reason that I-84, this I-84 route, likely was knocked off the table is in part because they want to send it to New Haven and Stamford, but also because there are 6.5% grades, significant 6.5% grades along that route. And as you recall, 1.5% grades are the ideal. So there are ways to get around that, but it's a problem.
Just to follow up with Stamford and New Haven, I understand their concern. I understand Stamford's and New Haven's concern. We don't want to starve them, of course. But if we were to improve the New Haven rail system, separate and apart from the high speed, we could significantly increase the speed of transport of those, and people might, going from here to Providence and other places, be using those as much anyhow. So I don't know that they necessarily, it seems to be an either or, a yes or no, a binary choice. And I don't know why we can't have a holistic plan rather than a binary choice.
No, I agree with you. So there's a couple of people in the back, and then I'll get to you, sir. I know. Let's go right here.
Hi. Greenwich Preservation Trust has been working on this since last January diligently, and we thank you for bringing it to our attention so that we could jump to the forefront on it. We have worked very hard, sending in letters, asking to be unbundled. And my question to you is, even with our senator supporting that we be unbundled, nothing occurred. We did not get dropped out of the package and for further study, which we were very hopeful that we could accomplish by all of the efforts. And I'm wondering, what will it take besides these questions, because we've been working very hard to make a difference and to further the study so that we could come up with less damaging effects on our historical properties and our waterfront, and pretty much the only charming part of town that has historical buildings would potentially be impacted in such a deleterious way. So what can you say to us? How much mass do we need to make a difference from Greenwich? Because so far, we haven't made any difference. It feels that way anyway.
Thank you. Well, I guess to put it in perspective, the most impacted town along the entire Northeast Corridor from Washington, D.C. to Boston was Old Lyme. That town, in fact, days before the initial public comment was to close, perhaps 6 people had submitted public comment on the plan. In the next 15 days with the Connecticut Trust, we got more public comments than New York, Boston, and Philadelphia combined. So that's part of how we did it. We had a meeting with the FRA. It wasn't a public hearing, they wouldn't give us one, but a meeting, and we had over 500 people there. And in fact, the fire marshal had to be called. And anytime you have a meeting where they call the fire marshal, you know you've won. And I will say this, we have had excellent support from the federal delegation, particularly from Senator Blumenthal. His staff has been very professional, has been very helpful, and I know his staff has taken a strong stance against this proposal in Fairfield County, and in fact, they took a strong stand early and encouraged engagement there. So far, we just haven't had the level of engagement, and here's another thing. If you want the support of your federal delegation, you have to make sure that the broader the coalition, the more it serves the entire state, the less it pits one town against the other, the more likely you are to get that statewide support. And in southeastern Connecticut, we managed to get every single municipality between Branford and Providence, Rhode Island, every single one against it. So that's how you stop it. I will say this, if we were in Tier 2 in southeastern Connecticut and it was knocked out here, southeastern Connecticut would be in a tough place. There are the resources here. There is the clout here. There's the heft that if you guys speak together, they have to obviously take you seriously. But this is a serious plan. Yeah.
Thank you. If you're of a certain age, you would remember that President Eisenhower proposed the interstate highway system. Yeah, okay. Well, there might be some who are as old as I am. And what that did was link together essentially every town of 25,000 or more. Part of the reason for it was national defense. But as they put it all in, it vastly changed our whole transportation network. And as they did that, towns started to spring up along the exit ramps and so forth. So there was a lot of investment taking place. You had mentioned three kinds of rail: high-speed, commuter, and freight. A lot of that is, of course, going through the existing lines that we have now. If they would repair the bridge across, I think it's Newburgh Beacon, I'm sorry if it's not quite there, but there's a freight bridge that has been out. If that got repaired, a lot of freight could come off of where we are and go up that route. And in fact, that would take trucks off of 95, which would alleviate some of the problems that we've got here. Part of that would improve the commuter system, but moving the high-speed rail further north would have less of an impact, as many people have spoken about here, the condemnation costs and so forth. You would then get investment along there, and some of the rural towns would then start to build up a little bit more. We currently have spur lines that go from Stamford to Danbury, which could then serve the high-speed rails further north. So I would love to see movement further north on this whole project.
Thank you. First, I'll just quickly touch on that simply to say that if you ask how you stop this project, stop the project is not to stop it, but to find better solutions. And so just what you're doing right now is the best way to stop it. It's both to slow down before there's momentum for this project, but also to seriously engage and to find better solutions for Connecticut. Yeah, I'll do this gal.
Thank you. I'm representing the Greenwich Historical Society's Preservation Network, and obviously we're very concerned, and we've already sent a letter to our delegates in opposition to this present plan. My question pertains to the three alternatives that theoretically were looked at. The I-84, the Long Island, and of course this one. Was there economic studies done on each one of them, and are they available, and what kind of analysis, both pro and con economically, for this area, did you find the results say?
If you go to the necfuture.com site in the project documents, I'm afraid there's some of them might be moving off the site right now, but in general, I have them if they are. There are studies that involve feasibility studies. They are what they refer to as not site-specific, so they're large overviews. You might find them somewhat disappointing. Many of the feasibility studies would happen at Tier 2. I cannot, in terms of the economic balances, I'm just not, don't have the expertise on that. I will say that studies were done. Yeah, Todd.
Hi, I'm Todd Bryant. I'm the president of the Norwalk Preservation Trust, and we've been locked in combat with the FTA now for a year and a half, 2 years on the Walk Bridge. And I just want to reinforce what Greg is saying, which is the more people, the better. Everybody on this line, from Greenwich all the way up to Greens Farms to Westport, needs to work together, because they will, they listen to numbers, they grade by weight, as we used to say in college. The more people show up at the meetings, the more emails they get, the more letters they get, the more public officials and elected officials they hear from. the better. And there will, and there will, they will, I mean, I hate to come out right out and say this, but they'll be trying to con you as you go along. So you really have to pay attention. I know you've never heard that before. So you really have to pay attention. You really have to be there every second, and somebody's got to be on top of it.
I'll make one quick comment, and then I see these hands back there. My general sense is that planners working in the Northeast Corridor, they have an enormously difficult problem ahead of them, and I sort of sometimes I can feel the con, but really what I'd like to say instead is that they have a difficult task. You have to understand that the public makes that task so much more difficult, I think for the better, and that's why I'm here. But there was a criticism of Robert Moses, who was, the great planner, and the criticism was that he loved the public, but not as people. And to some extent, when I've looked at this plan and I've looked at the level of engagement, I'd say this is a plan for the public good, but it hasn't really engaged the people. And I think that's a mistake, actually. I think the best way to get this done is to get the public on board. And I found that a lot of the towns are remarkably willing to work with the Federal Railroad Administration, but so far it's hard to work with an agency that won't let you see the maps or won't give you a good sense of flexibility or how to work with them. So my hope is that at the next level, we will have a much better relationship and we will encourage a much better engagement. I'd say one of the first things that we should have in Fairfield County is a meeting with the Federal Railroad Administration in Fairfield County that includes the public and allows the public to ask questions. And that doesn't seem too much to ask. And frankly, I think it's the best chance the Federal Railroad Administration has to set a good tone, get people on board for finding some kind of solution together.
Just another quick question. In Greenwich, we're in a very unique position because we have neighbors to the west, Westchester County. This is coming out of New Rochelle. My question is, to date, how much dialogue has there been with Westchester and with the municipalities that are being affected there, potentially? How important, this is kind of a rhetorical question, how important is it to start a dialogue? And if it's, if it hasn't been done, how can it be done? And how quickly should that endeavor start to take place?
In southeastern Connecticut, part of the way we managed to change the plan is we got the governor of Rhode Island, who potentially was the main beneficiary of the Kenyon to Old Saybrook bypass. She came out against it. We got Rhode Island aboard, and when you get 2 states and 4 senators on board, then things happen. And certainly Chuck Schumer in New York is a huge an influential voice in terms of infrastructure and rail travel. This would impact Rye, and there's obviously communities there that are important. So far, my engagement, I'd love to meet with representatives from New York. I haven't yet. But I was actually driving down this morning and saying, well, if we can get the same kind of dialogue we've had with Rhode Island, then we're really cooking. So. You've had your hand up for a long time. Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Patrick from Greenwich, and I'm trying to digest this. We definitely need infrastructure, definitely. But this kind of infrastructure has no bearing on the problem of non-productive economy. And without that, where is this train going to? I mean, I like to buy a Mercedes-Benz, but I live in a basement. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that you have to put priority first. Now, infrastructure is the most important thing there is, because without rebuilding the factories and putting people back to work, you have nothing. And this future is dying unless we give our children and grandchildren a future. Now, the infrastructure, why not have it the whole country in infrastructure instead of Connecticut? There is already a infrastructure which is being prepared by the administration.
To touch on that, part of the reason the Connecticut Trust got on board on this issue right away was we looked at the years ahead and we said, whatever part of NEC Future is built or not built, whatever part of Let's Go CT is built or not built, we're looking at huge investments, particularly along coastal Connecticut, that will have vast impacts, whether it's induced growth for better or worse, whether it's impacts to the environment. This is a reason we've engaged. Let me say that a couple things on your point. One is we're entering a stage, to repeat, that's called the Service Development Plan. There is something called a Service Development Working Group, and the NEC Commission will take a leading stance. Our representative, I believe, on that will be James Redeker. And so one thing to ask James Redeker is, what are Connecticut's priorities for the Service Development Plan, which prioritizes and implements NEC Future? Can you focus on things that help with commuter rail or help inland towns that potentially does not push the ball down the road on the New Rochelle to Greens Farms bypass? Because part of what we see with a project like this is the hard parts come a little later. And the first parts, they start building this piecemeal, and so the New Rochelle to Greens Farms bypass, in some ways, in just completely inoffensive ways, will start to be built with every project. Every project that will be built will conform to it. So we want to make sure that we don't sort of build in an inevitability to any plan that doesn't best serve this area. I touch on one thing. In a sense, when I'm coming here, I guess the Connecticut Trust is coming in a sort of a warning, an engagement, a bit of opposition, but I'd say this. 2/3, when I sit in a meeting, a staff meeting with the Connecticut Trust, 2/3 of our conversations deal with investment, deal with development, deal with working on repurposing, reusing historic structures, on tax credits. We're trying to find solutions both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the existing historic resources that serve Connecticut's economy. And we're not trying to get in the way of things that are helpful. That we're trying to be part of the solution. And that's why I come here and say your best answer here is to find solutions because we need them. Yeah, you.
Greg, thank you for holding the forum. Representative Camillo, thank you for sending out the email. My question is, if the plan goes through the way that you see it right now, there's a big branch off as the train comes into Coscob. It bears out over Mianus River Bridge, kind of like that loop over. Which side of the train, to the best of your knowledge, will the train go on 95? So if you're going north, will it be on the right side or will it be on the left side? Going north towards Boston, will it be on the right side or the left side?
There is flexibility in the planning, so I'm a little wary of giving an exact impact. This is an issue that's very important for historic preservationists. As you probably know, the National Historic Landmark Bush Holly House is, I believe, 150 is it 154 feet from its front step to the I-95? And there's also been talk of potential widening of I-95. So it's very important. Our sense at this moment is that it's more likely to run on the opposite side of I-95, but we're not sure. So that would be on the south side. The water side of I-95.
Now you're going through neighborhoods. You're going through
Yeah, we're talking, it's sort of hard to even imagine some of the impacts in Riverside and Darien, and it really is, it's part of the reason why the maps are so important, just to get a sense of them and to look at the GIS maps. What's that? You'll have to speak into the mic.
An example of what we're talking about, that twist that you take on 95 where it goes funny over the railroad back and forth and across the Minas Bridge and takes a bend north and over, was because the political of the more wealthy people of Lower Riverside didn't want it to go through Riverside, about where the Riverside Yacht Club is. That was the original plan, and they put their push together and shoved it north. Same thing happened if you look at the Merritt Parkway. There's that big loop in Greenwich. It goes a big loop north. When that was built, that went right around all the Rockefeller properties rather than through it. So there may be some point about heft.
What's
just historical?
Yeah, no.
Couple things. One is that somebody raised a point about assumptions. I think it's quite clear that anytime a major project is done like this, the people that put the project together are selective in what assumptions and projections they use to support their project. So I think it would be very useful for people to, if there was some group that could really do an independent analysis of all these assumptions before deciding on which ones to go to. Secondly, on the face of it, it sounds like in terms of benefits to Connecticut, the I-84 route would be provide more benefits in general economically than the current route. Has there been any discussion with the towns along I-84 that might support such a thing to get them on board to use that route? And the third question is, in terms of if the route were to continue along more or less the railroad line now, I understand that the issues are curvature and grade. But when you look at the map, it looks like they're basically buying all new land throughout most of Riverside. And it seemed to me it'd be a lot less expensive to straighten out some of the curves and maybe have some aerial things or whatever to fix the grade. And my question is, are they avoiding that because they don't want to have to deal with Metro North? Are they preferring to have the taxpayer spend a lot more money, cause a lot more disruption, just because they themselves don't want to have to coordinate with Metro North?
I will say that, let's see, in terms of the studies and choices, I would encourage you to go back to public comment that was submitted both for the draft environmental impact statement in November. It was released in November 2015. There was a whole round of thousands of comments. There are various detailed studies. There were ones for the final environmental impact statement, which was released this last December. So you can go in, there's thousands of comments. It's available through necfuture.com. In terms of I-84, I will say that I met with at a roundtable that was held by Congresswoman Esty with various of the councils of government and mayors a few months ago that was quite interested in this I-84 plan. I'm wary of suggesting other routes or other impacts for other towns, or to play, as I say, amateur engineer. These people are the best at their game. This is what they do. But so far, I do know that there has been some interest in an inland route, and there's questions of have the inland routes been looked at carefully enough. There was another, I've forgotten what the last comment you made, but I think the straightening the curves. Right now, obviously, if you look, it's a lot of the additional trains that would run potentially would be Metro North trains. And so the actual number of high-speed rail trains would pale compared to the Metro North trains. So yes, Amtrak would prefer not to have to run behind slow-moving commuter rail. Yeah. In terms of curbs, in terms of running above, it would be too curved.
No, but I mean, not the whole line, but adjusting for where the curves are would be a lot less expensive than buying up all this.
As I would say, those are the kinds of questions you can ask the FRA when you have if you have a meeting with the FRA, and they'll have experts there. Let me tell you, Ruby Siegel, who I've talked to, who works with AECOM, who does the environmental studies, knows every inch of these routes and every hill. It's remarkable what they know. So they have reasons.
Thank you. Steve Purdy, Byram resident, and I'm also an Uber driver, so things involving commute directly affect my wallet. And I was thinking to myself, if we're talking about economic growth and how this rail helps our economic growth, Bridgeport, why don't we put a stop in Bridgeport, which will help Bridgeport's economy? And anything that helps that is going to help out the whole state.
One of the problems, I think this is a frustration of planners, that planners would love to build stations and infrastructure for struggling towns that need them to regrow them, but that's not often how democracies work. Democracies tend to plan long-range plans based on where the power and where the people and where the money is today. And it's a frustration I know they have, but it's hard to, even an I-84 route, right now if they build an I-84 route, the chances that it would stop in Waterbury are zero. And even when we looked at the Storrs route, which they had talked about that ran east from Hartford, if you actually look through 2040, there was a stop, but there were actually no trains stopping there in the plan. So I guess that's one answer. I'd say the planners of this are probably agree with you.
So I wanted to find out, what is the timing of this, of the train? It seems like it's going to be long drawn out, 10 years, 20 years. What is the timing? And also, I know Tesla just got approval to build an underground pod, high-speed pod. So if this timing is long drawn out, maybe high-speed train will be obsolete at this point. Anyways.
Technological solutions. That actually is a great question, because I forgot to give you one little bit of information. So you look at this and you say, well, gee, we'll never be able to fund this. That's fine. At the moment, we're not really in a funding stage. What we are in is we're in a planning and environmental review stage. So if you look at what happened across the Susquehanna River, the plan it's been locked in with its mitigation, with its record of decision, with no plan to fund it for another decade. So 10 years in the future locked in. And so one thing that you would definitely want to be careful about is, okay, this plan a shovel might not touch this for 15 or 20 years. You don't want to lock in. Clearly there's a 2030 number that they're looking at for capacity, but you don't want to lock in a 2030 plan over the next some few years, because that's what's happened. We've already moved through a very significant stage of environmental review, Tier 1, and the point of this plan really was to take a raft of hundreds of projects, move it through, in some ways, the very significant, difficult part of environmental review, and now it's in the plan. In terms of technology, I would look at Elon Musk's plans with a jaundiced eye. I would encourage you to read, there's a great blogger and his name is Alon Levy. And he actually, I think he's in Paris right now looking for an academic job. He can't actually come to America because of a visa situation. But he writes about every foot of traffic that runs along the Connecticut coastline. He talks about tonnage of rock that they have to remove, and this guy was doing this in Switzerland. So it's not that some people have really been paying attention. And his general sense is that a 220, this 220, hypothetical 220 top end, is about what's running even for most of the traffic in China and most of the traffic in Japan. There is some faster for shorter, but we're a big country, and most of it probably isn't cost effective. And so they've chosen this for a reason.
Hi, Sarah Harris from the town of Westport, representing the First Selectman. I just want to say that we are concerned with the environmental and residential disruption that this plan could have on our community, and that we don't want to repeat the same mistakes that were made with the I-95. And with that said, I do want to say that we are very interested in staying a part of any collective action. But I do need to ask, why Greens Farm? This is a small, basic station. What do they have in plan?
It's one of the most beautiful parts of the state, I think. I think everyone will agree. There's an oddity of the plan that the plan actually, NEC Future for Connecticut, called for 2 new stations. One would be in the sort of a rural area in eastern Connecticut. I think it was the Groton, it was the New London Mystic Station, but it was neither in New London nor Mystic. It was in Groton, in the middle of nowhere. And Greens Farms, in addition, is why this. I don't know. I couldn't tell you why exactly. I will say my understanding for the Westport is particularly, there is also there's transit-oriented development, and as I understand it. And so part of the problem when you have flexibility or unknown flexibility in unknown maps is transit-oriented development, I think, is something that a lot of municipalities are getting on board. How do we build close to the rails? Well, how do you invest millions of dollars along routes that might change or will wipe them out? That's been a problem certainly in Branford when they just realized that they were planning something right in the route of the new quad tracking. So I appreciate Westport, and hopefully our sense is to work with every community, and I'm happy to meet on a personal level, or with our staff on a personal level, to meet individually or meet as a group, and we'll come down here anytime you want to talk.
I just want to say thank you for coming. I was at your meeting in May, and that was a huge wake-up call. I had no idea that this was even being planned. I've tried to contact NEC many times. My emails have not only gone unanswered, they've just been returned. So I haven't even been able to get through to NEC. I would warmly welcome everyone coming together from all the towns, from officials to just regular people such as myself, and meeting with the FRA and just learning more. I'm also just had 2 questions. The first is, what do you know about this independent study, this $3 million consultant, yes, the $3 million consultant study that's being done that somehow got funded by the state of Connecticut? And second, I feel that outside this room, people really don't know that this is happening. There has been very little publicity for these meetings and about the infrastructure project. And quite frankly, when I talk to people, they look at me like I'm insane, and they just don't believe it could possibly happen. And so they just shut down. And I don't know how to get through to them. If you have any suggestions about how to talk to people about this, because I know that people care. I just think that people just can't conceive of such a thing ever happening.
Okay, and
the gentleman's name is Douglas Gasson. And and his number is 202-493-0239. 493-0239. His name was Douglas, or Doug Gasson, Gascon.
He's the spokesperson for NEC Future. Okay, 1 second, and let me say, at the back of the packet that I gave you, it has contact information for the key people on this plan. If you write to them, I would please be polite. Don't flood them. What we need right now is better communication. But those are the people on the back, and those are the players. And so, for serious communication and serious questions, please, they should be hearing from you right now. But be good about it.
Thank you. I'm kind of John Doe of Greenwich. I first on these issues. I'm not, the importance of infrastructure seems reasonable in one sense, but the question is, what are the sources of this traffic? And since it's a high-speed train, this is a high-speed train. It's just high speed through the Connecticut, because if it has to stop in Connecticut, it would not be high speed. It would be slow, and they compete with Amtrak. Are we creating competitors so that we have neither high speed nor Amtrak can economically survive? And the sources of this traffic, what are they? What uncertainty is involved with those sources? So yeah, infrastructure sounds like something nice, like having a bigger house, Yeah, I like to have a bigger house too. But the thing is the economy going to support it? Can I afford the mortgage that's involved in that? I like to see some of the basics addressed. Here are the sources of the traffic, and this is whom is serving, and the people who is serving should be paying mostly, and not the people who are just used as a conduit just to bypass this high-speed traffic through their own place. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I will say that that one idea that has been posed, I think Joe McGee of the Business Council of Fairfield County, who's very knowledgeable on these matters. I'm not sure is there anyone from the Business Council here? So has discussed the idea of a 30-30-30 plan. And that's basically 30 minutes from New York to Stamford, 30 minutes from Stamford to New Haven, 30 minutes from New Haven to Hartford. And so this is one idea. This current plan calls for a 2-hour and 45-minute transit between New York and Boston. And the demand is always one of those tricky ones in the sense that demand, if you look at the plan, basically it says the more people we run, the cheaper it will be, the cheaper it is, the more people will, it's a circular argument. Yet we do know that no matter what, I think we can be pretty certain that Connecticut would benefit from better transit and that capacity will need to increase, and that I think we all realize that I-95, particularly from Bridgeport to New York, is a disaster. And so in a sense that, there are real reasons for it, for this planning. There you go. I'll give one to Jim.
I'm Jim Cameron from Darien. I've been a commuter activist for 25 years. I write a newspaper column in the Hearst papers called Getting There. Front page, Greenwich Time, every Monday. To answer this lady's question up there, how do you get your neighbors involved? Get that newspaper. Read the paper. Watch your local town television station. Greenwich TV 79 is broadcasting this live. It'll be repeated. It'll be repeated in the local government stations in Westport and in Darien. I'm the program director, so I'll make that happen. You need to make people be engaged. This is happening. We have to, however, as Greg has pointed out, and thank you, Greg, for being here, we have to have a reasonable conversation with the FRA. We cannot come off looking like rich NIMBYs who, in theory, support the idea of high-speed rail unless it affects our own property values. That's, I think, the biggest concern that I've seen from people when they've seen my objections to this plan, that it looks like it's in our self-interest. We're only worried about our neighborhoods. We're not worried about the economy of the Northeast Corridor. So I think that all of us here today not only need to contact our state elected officials, but call Jim Himes' office, call Senator Blumenthal, call Senator Murphy, and let them know that we need them to be engaged on our behalf on this issue. Thanks.
Hi, I'd like to try and answer a question that some of you have asked about how did we get the word out. My name's Deanie Mallory. I'm a former Greenwich resident, but I now live in Old Lyme, and I've been working with this group since the beginning. And I can tell you that in our tiny little town, in our tiny little area, Facebook was one of the biggest means by which we got through to everybody from Old Saybrook to Westerly, Rhode Island. So it was Facebook. It was our little local paper initially, came on board with us, and on every Facebook post, thanks to Greg Stroud and Robin, we had names and addresses, telephone numbers of who to write, who to contact, the state reps, the FRA, everything. So we made it very, very simple for all of these 4,500 or so people that wrote letters. And it worked.
Yeah, there's Robin Breeding and Deanie Mallory have been working on this they're sort of the silent partners, but have been working every day on this for 18 months. Yes, Jamie.
Thank you. Jamie Stevenson, First Selectman of the Town of Darien, and I also wear the hat of Chairman of the Western Connecticut Council of Governments, which, if you're not familiar with that organization, it's really the successor to the old SWRPA planning organization. So we do play an integral role and will, as this plan or any pieces thereof move forward, it will have to be approved by the member municipalities. We have 18 of them. So we will be delighted to continue to work with all of you in this room to have a robust dialogue with the folks that can help us influence the most. And I do want to credit the governor when he came out with his comments about the situation in Old Lyme, that he really favors a plan that is state of good repair for the rail lines that we have right now, which is really what we want in southwestern Connecticut too. We're not opposed to high-speed rail, but this plan was really rolled out without tremendous input from any of us, and I sincerely hope that the Tier 2 environmental analysis will include an economic analysis, not only positives, but the negatives that will happen regarding this plan to communities. I'm curious if anyone is here from Stamford. Okay. It's unfortunate they're not here because Stamford, being the central city in our Council of Governments, has a very large voice in this planning process. So I welcome the ability to help gather the right people around the table, including the city of Stamford, to continue the dialogue.
Thank you, Jamie. I couldn't agree more. The COGS, in fact, are the closest we have to a county government. They have enormous expertise, and we found in southeastern Connecticut the COGS have been central to helping work and in that case oppose the plan. In this case, Francis Pickering has been certainly very involved in the planning and would be a great resource moving forwards.
This is probably the scariest question of the day. Down in Fort Pierce in Florida, a private partnership put together a high-speed rail line right through the historic district of that town, ruining my client's property values and ruining their town, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Yes, and it happened very, very quickly, and my call to arms for all of you is in the New York Times today. Mr. Trump was featured having his shadow infrastructure planning committee. and it's run predominantly by people in private equity. So there is a possibility that he could sidestep the federal government funding this project and go straight to private equity to help out and put the majority of the money together to put in a rail line. And that is something that does concern me greatly because there's no discussion, and we as a town had no discussion at the beginning of the Tier 1 to even fight about it. If it wasn't for the Connecticut Trust, we wouldn't have known about it. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, for the last 16 months, we have been working loosely with organizations that are engaging the Florida issue. In fact, in that case, indeed, that I believe it's Fortress Capital is providing a lot of the funding. There are still funding and bonding issues. There still have to go through federal permitting process. So it's not like they can fully work around the process, but indeed there are serious concerns down there. They had seemed to have sort of beaten it, and now it's come back. And let me say, let's see about that. Oh, I forgot what I was going to say. Anyhow, I think that I do believe that that Florida is a good example of how one of these large-scale infrastructure projects can happen rather quickly. In this case, the so-called $1 trillion infrastructure project from the administration isn't, as last we've heard, it hasn't really been going anyplace. And I would encourage you to neither take a refuge in that or the opposite, in the sense that most of this at this point is really not about funding, I think. But indeed, the Northeast Corridor is one of the few portions of the corridor that potentially could actually support some kind of public-private partnership. Yes.
I have a brief question about safety, and we have seen that there have been some issues of derailments and collisions and so forth on our present line. And fortunately, even though there has been loss of life, it's been rather limited. But given the fact that these trains are going to be traveling at over 200 miles an hour and some of them elevated, have they looked at the aspects of, if a train derails and it's, 60 feet up in the air, what happens? Or two trains traveling 200 miles an hour opposite one another?
Yes. What I will say is that this plan would essentially, one of the aspects that's most difficult for high-speed rail is at-grade crossings, and those certainly cause the most safety issues. There are huge at-grade crossing problems with the Florida project, but this would eliminate many of them. I would, safety is, I would say that right now we're moving towards something called positive train control. I know that Senator Blumenthal's staff has been particularly engaged, but the entire delegation has, and that should increase safety and should actually allow trains to move closer together, which would potentially solve some of this capacity issue. Essentially, positive train control puts a GPS in each of the trains so you know where they are, and the more you know where they are, the closer you can put them together. And so we look at high-speed rail and we say, the last thing you want to do, the last investment is a new rail corridor. Everything else you can do to avoid new rail corridor because it costs more than anything else and it has the greatest impacts. So if you can increase capacity with longer station platforms for longer trains. Most trains, I think now, are they running at 6 cars? There are, I think, many of the stations here in Fairfield County are up to 10 cars, but I don't believe all of them are. Every station should have 10-car platforms. That will allow more capacity, running them closer together with high-speed rail. We have issues of bridges opening and closing. The more you negotiate bridges opening and closing to allow more trains to transit, the less likely you have to build more corridors. So that's the kind of compromise that we're talking to towns to engage that. I'm not sure in this area, but in southeastern Connecticut, those negotiations for the train openings and closings, the bridge openings and closings are It's 2018. If that's the same here, I would encourage engagement. This right here. And then,
In terms of global warming and rising sea levels, why would we put infrastructure closer to the seas? And I'm thinking about Sandy, and having lived through that, and knowing that the storms are getting stronger and more destructive, why would we put important infrastructure closer to that threat?
The way we look at this plan is this. Imagine I-95 is a string, and it's a string that's pulled fairly tight, like this. The Northeast Corridor is also a string, but it's kind of sagging underneath I-95. So NEC Future essentially takes that saggy string and pulls it tight. And it pulls it tight first to the east and to the west, and that's what this plan is doing. And it still sags right around Guilford and Brantford, particularly. It runs right along the water. I do think that there are significant resiliency issues, and inland routes offer potential solutions to those. I would say we've got a problem. We have, in a post-Sandy, post-9/11 world, we have, for a lot of the NEC corridor, we have 2 tracks connecting New York to Boston running along the ocean. And so it's again where I say that the best answer, the lowest impact answer, is to work and engage and to find better solutions, because I want a solution to that, you know. But again, investing along the ocean, the less you do that, the better, obviously. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Rich Keogh. I head up the Connecticut office for Senator Blumenthal, and so he has been very engaged, as Greg has indicated, in the issue of the NEC Future, and learned an awful lot from the Old Lyme Eastern Connecticut fight about the whole process and what really does influence the FRA. And it is sort of a combined effort, as Greg had indicated. It is important that we all in Southwest Connecticut come together and figure out what it is that as a region you want to see, because at the end of the day, this document is all about sort of a nice thing to happen. It's a way in which they can speed rail through Connecticut. And if they are not clear as to the impacts on the community, then they think that there really isn't any. And the fact that Eastern Connecticut came together and was very, very clear in how this would impact open space, impact the historical districts, was very effective in getting that piece removed. It's a little more complicated, I can appreciate, in southwestern Connecticut, but the same process still should happen. And so we'll be looking at convening a meeting. We'll be talking with all of you guys about that to really sort of start to come together on this issue and lay the groundwork for getting the voices heard early on in this process, because there's still a lot of time for things to change and things to actually halt. And then finally, I can't resist. We were talking about moving it seaward, moving the rail seaward here in the Greenwich Westport area. The interesting part was that in southeastern Connecticut, one of their sort of reasons for moving the straight line was to prevent the impact of hurricanes and stuff from the rail. So while it seemed like a good argument in eastern Connecticut, I would think it would be a very good argument in southwestern Connecticut as well. Thank you.
Yes.
I would like to thank the Connecticut Trust for providing such an informative session. I would ask, however, as I've listened to your comments, it sounds like it's largely a political equation. Rhode Island was able to change things. Presumably, other you've said we should get together on a political basis. But what has been the stance of the Malloy administration during this 5-year period insofar as the three options? You know, is this a political gift to Stamford and to New Haven? Is it, what comments did they provide with respect to the 684 I-84 route? What approach have they taken during this 5 years? And how did they discharge their fiduciary responsibility to Connecticut to inform people as to their perspective so that people had an opportunity to offer comments and perhaps alternative insights?
Thank you. I don't want to put words in the mouth of the governor or the current administration. I will say that we have had excellent bipartisan support, both from Republicans and Democrats. I would encourage you to find the governor's staff has submitted public comment both on the FEIS, the final plan, and the draft plan. And the governor's general stand has been to support most of all a state of good repair, as I think Jamie made clear, and it's true, is to work on what exists. I would say that we have a little bit of perhaps disconnect right now with the Connecticut DOT on the issue on a disagreement on priority, if you will, or seriousness of this plan. But the Connecticut DOT has excellent engaged staff, and I'll leave it at there. Other? One more, and then.
I was just wondering if the representative from Senator Blumenthal's office knew anything about this $3 million consultant survey that. Yes.
Can I hit that too, and I'll explain this. Technically, we have been waiting in suspense for the release of the final plan, and it was released on July 12th. Sometime before that, the Connecticut DOT began a study on this portion of the corridor. It's state-funded. It's roughly $3 million. It's the same basic planners that are already engaged with NEC Future. I know Ruby Siegel is one of those planners. I don't know the nature of that plan. It's a great question to ask the Connecticut DOT. You know, I assume this came from their budget. They have some kind of contingency fund, and this was part of some contingency fund. But it would be, I think, a great question for representatives. What are you studying? You know, what are the goals of this study? When did you begin the study? And I assume that there are many great reasons for the Connecticut DOT to study this, but I don't know the answer. I believe the question, do you have any interest in? Yeah. Yep. So technically, this plan will require state and federal funds to go forward. So the number I would encourage you to look at again, and I'll leave you with, I think we're done now probably, is 80-20. And that's the reason to take it seriously. When you look and you say this is unaffordable, well, you say if it's unaffordable at 20%, it's really unaffordable at 100%. So, and we have real problems. How are we going to fund them?